I came to DIMACS the same year that Rebecca did, and spent 3 wonderful years at DIMACS, and thinking about work I've really been engaged in since then, and people I've really enjoyed collaborating with, either in technical things or in education, and a lot of that comes back to my time at DIMACS. And so I think of Rebecca as catalyzing a lot of that, and also being a great friend and providing good insight as I thought work through career decisions. So for many reasons, thank you. I may elaborate on that this evening, but the brief version, no, thank you. And so this is, I'm talking about accountability in computing, and this is work that's been joint with Rebecca and also with Joan Feigenbaum over the last better part of a decade. And it'll actually talk about a couple of threads in this, both some technical and some survey of what's been done, which you really need to get at in order to make those technical, that technical progress. So if we're talking about accountability, we should say what we mean by accountability, and that actually motivates the rest of this talk. And accountability is generally used to connote some sort of security that complements preventive measures. And it's generally viewed as a good thing, whatever it happens to mean. That is, you rarely hear people say, like, this system has too much accountability, right? That's just not something you get. But beyond that, things are pretty much a mess. Okay? And so the question of how do we formalize accountability enough so that we can reason about it and get some technical results, especially in how identity and accountability are in tension and what boundaries we can identify. But that means we also need to start looking at all the different ways in which this term has been used. And initially, that was just enough to inform what we've been doing. And more recently, that's been in a survey that some draft monograph is wending its way through some system right now. But looking at how has this term and related concepts been thought about and used and implemented in computer science and in other disciplines. So in doing a survey like that, you can get all sorts of wonderful, evocative quotes. A couple of them. One is accountability is a protean concept, a placeholder for multiple contemporary anxieties in the context of administrative law. In the context of public administration, it's been said that accountability has not yet had time to accumulate a substantial tradition of academic analysis. There has been little agreement or even common ground of disagreement over the general nature of accountability or its various mechanisms. And both of these are from maybe a decade or a little bit more ago, but these are in disciplines that have an even more developed tradition of thinking about accountability. So in computer science, there's even less of a consensus here. And so part of what we're trying to think about in this work is how do we improve that? So part of that question is, what are definitions? And we'll start by thinking about what have they been, and then we'll propose something that argues about this is what we think it should be, or I think at least a useful definition. And in looking at all these different definitions in the literature, something that eventually emerged was this idea that they focus at different points along some temporal spectrum. So we think of preventive things as entirely separate from accountability, and those happen before a violation occurs. But then after a violation occurs, some accountability mechanisms might focus on how do we detect that this occurred. Others focus on how can we gather evidence, not just that it occurred, but evidence that's suitable for presentation to a third party. And sort of underlying a lot of these ideas is like, what's a natural flow in terms of the judicial system? Right? So how do we collect evidence that we can take to a judge? And then somebody might render judgment, and other mechanisms and definitions focus on that rendering of a judgment. And then others focus on how do we punish entities that have been adjudged to be guilty or blameworthy. And one of the things that's interesting in looking at these different mechanisms and definitions is that a lot of the things that are focused, at least on the surface, on let's detect violations or let's provide evidence, really assume that there's some sort of ambient, like legal system or some sort of punishment mechanism that exists, even though it's not part of the definition. So even though definitions might talk about accountability in terms of providing evidence, it really is implicitly assuming that somewhere there's going to be punishment later on. Okay, and so that influenced our thinking that we want to shift our focus towards the later end of this spectrum. and say the core definitions and goals that we want to get at are living down by the punishment area, or maybe deterrence. And those two things are combined. And that also helps us as we think about identity, and saying there might be things where identity might be baked into the evidence or the detection parts of things. But if we're focusing further later on in this spectrum, let's reduce any identity requirements that are artifacts of focusing on evidence, and make sure that the only identity that we bake into our definitions is stuff that's actually required for our end goals. Now, it might be that we use identity to achieve those goals, but we don't want it baked into the definitions that we have. Okay. And some of the language that I'll be using, just as a brief note, I'll be thinking about principles who might naturally be thought of as people, could also be other entities, taking on some identity or a NIM, and using that NIM to do an action. And we'll think of the NIM and the action as living inside of a system. This might be logging into a computer, and then your login is doing something on the computer, analogous to that. And these things are laid out in this way because a little bit later on we'll fill in other concepts that make this real estate arrangement make sense. But that's the language that I'll be using, principles and NIMs and actions. Now, in surveying the different definitions that have been used throughout the literature, a lot of them hit the parts of that temporal spectrum that I talked about already: detection, evidence, judgment or blame, punishment and deterrence. Others talk about associating actions and identities, which may be used for evidence, but they might even say accountability talks about this association and having that association. Some definitions say that. Other definitions, a lot coming from outside of computer science, but also we'll see at least some in computer science talk about answerability, the notion of being called to account, as a phrasing often used in those settings. So these are all types of definitions that we see, and there are lots of definitions that fall under each of these categories. I'll talk about a very limited selection, but just to give a flavor that yes, I mean, we actually see these things being proposed in the wild. And later on, I'll flash very briefly some results or some summaries that show also there are mechanisms that try to implement all those different types of definitions. Okay? So one definition in the context of storage was that talked about detection. So, and this is really getting at if a participant can determine for itself if others are behaving correctly. Okay, so not a notion of going and convincing somebody, no evidence, but just detection. That's what accountability meant in that context. A more evidence-focused definition from a little bit earlier on talked about whether or not something can be proved to a third party. Okay, and that's this distinction that we're making between detection and evidence is it intended to go to a third party? Okay, now there might be some things, some of these concepts sort of straddle lines between, well, you know, this system or mechanism provides both some detection and some evidence, but we try to distinguish them on say, is the focus on going to a third party, or is that just an auxiliary benefit that might be seen? Another one more recently talks about having non-repudiable evidence of all nodes' actions, and this is in the context of a system called peer review that I'll come back to a little bit later. That's turned out to be quite influential in computer science. But maintaining a tamper-evident record of all nodes' actions that provides non-repudiable evidence. So a couple of definitions in the evidence family of things. In terms of the association and identification, that is binding actions and the identities. Yumura, Effendi, and Chase, a little bit earlier than their previous definition, said, well, we should be talking about associating states and actions with identities. Okay. So not saying that one of these is, say, better in a particular context than another one, but saying we see both in computer science and elsewhere a wide range of definitions for this amorphous term of accountability. In public administration, we see an example of being called to account for actions, and as I alluded to before, this is a common outside of computer science, being called to account is a common sense of accountability. But it also shows up, shows up in international relations, and also there are lots of there's some taxonomies in administrative law that talk about answerability, whether it's to your bosses vertically or directed to your peers, or is it down to your customers or the people who elected you. So there's this tradition outside of computer science that has focused in large part on answerability. Yes?
It's one of those things that you can notice it when it's not there.
Yes. Yeah. And you generally notice it, and you wish it were there, typically.
Yeah.
Right, yes. But we also see answerability, that sense in computer science, and this notion from the A4 Cloud project, talking about needing to explain and justify actions, along with some other things. And typically, it seems like European efforts at formalizing accountability have included that, have been more governance focused, and the governance focus comes along with this sense of answerability. At least has seemed to be one of the things we've noticed in looking at lots of these different definitions. There have also been punishment-focused ones, some in international relations, so not only in computer science. In international relations, talking about being able to do lots of things, including judgment, but a key part of this imposing sanctions if responsibilities weren't met. And then one that influenced us, notably from Butler-Lamson, talking about accountability is the ability to hold an entity such as a person or organization responsible for its actions. Now, exactly what responsible for its actions mean, right? This is another one of these ambiguities, but this has certainly influenced our thinking. So what we've argued is that we'd like to say that a principal is accountable with respect to some policy violation, or accountable for violating the policy, if, when the principal commits the policy violation, then it is, or it could be, punished in a targeted fashion. And there are a few terms in here that we should unpack. So one thing is that this, or could be, we're allowing the intentional refraining from punishment. So if I'm running a law enforcement investigation and I still am trying to get the kingpin, I might want to avoid punishing the low-level person so I don't blow up my case. I don't want to say that that means I've lost accountability there. We'd like punishment and not just blame. And as you can imagine, a bank robber, their face is seen clearly on a video, but they managed to successfully flee to a tropical island. We'd like them to actually be punished if we're going to say that there's accountability there. We also don't want to require blame as long as punishment occurs. And this is something that we'll come back to when I talk a little bit about terminology at the end. But we have a notion of what we were calling automatic punishment, which in probabilistic settings is incentive compatibility in the right flavor. So we don't necessarily want to say that somebody has to step in, a judge has to step in and declare guilt and send you off to prison, if what we really care about is that you're going to be punished. Okay. Now, the others might have worthwhile societal benefits. We're not saying that we don't care about the justice system or something like that. We're saying we'd like to distinguish the importance of these things and distinguish them conceptually and say, if what we care about is punishment, let's identify that as something that's separate from the process of someone standing in judgment and sending you off to prison. Okay. And then the last note on this is that we added, since our original work on this, the idea that punishment should be targeted and not just broad. That is, you shouldn't be able to send everybody in society to prison and have that count as punishment, which is a worthwhile thing. Yeah. So some other goals here. Bad luck shouldn't count as punishment. You rob a bank and get hit by a bus on your way out of the bank. You're not then punished. And we shouldn't have to undo good luck in order to say that you're punished. Like, if you bought a lottery ticket, robbed the bank, won the lottery with that ticket, we shouldn't have to claw back all your winnings to reduce you to where you were before in order to say that you were punished. I said it before, we want things to be targeted and not collective, and we want things to be linked to the violation itself. And that's, well, we'll talk about that a little bit later. So formalizing this, we do this in using traces of system actions. And as I said before, principals will take on NIMs to do those actions. The actions have a principal associated with them, which might not be visible to other participants, but from our bird's eye view, we get to see who did what thing. And then the principals are the ones who have utilities. So we're doing this in a utility theoretic fashion. The principals have utilities that are defined on outcomes of the system. We then extend those to partial traces. So we can say, well, what are the possible ways that the system could evolve from this point? Let's use that to give you some sense of utility at this intermediate point in time. I mentioned before we had this notion of automatic punishment. If there are probabilities, say distributions over the utilities that everybody has, that looks like ex ante Bayes-Nash incentive compatibility. However, we don't want to assume that. It might be that we only know which which utilities are more typical and which are less typical, but we might not have a probability distribution there. So our definition doesn't require us to have those distributions. This sort of gets at the idea, like there are some real sociopaths who aren't deterred by standard punishment. And so the regular jail sentence might deter in the legal system most people from committing certain crimes, but it doesn't deter the far outliers. And so either there are less typical utilities or there are utilities with very low distributions or low probabilities associated with them. I won't go into too much detail here, but mediated punishment just captures the idea that this is our other notion of punishment, saying that we have some event that happens after the violation that actually reduces your utility. So it's not automatically happening in an incentive compatibility sort of way. Life progresses on normally in this blue part of the trace, and then somebody commits a violation and things evolve a bit more, and then there's a punishing event. Maybe a judge does something, sends you to prison, and what happens after that, the violator's utility there should be lower than the violator's utility would have been if we removed the violation and anything that was causally dependent on it. So that's this dashed subtrace here saying we're taking out a number of different events that all depend on the violation, whatever they may be, and then letting the system continue to evolve. And so those are the utilities that we're comparing there, essentially capturing somebody has actively done something to make you worse off than you would have been had the violation never occurred. And another key thing here is that we want the punishing event to be causally dependent on the violation and not just something random. But in this, we're treating causality as a black box. So there are different formalizations of causality. We might talk about, say, we've at least argued we could use the Halpern-Pearl approach to saying this punishing event is caused by the violation, but we don't require it to be a specific approach to causality. Could be something else. So some things that COP, in thinking about this, when is punishment effective? That's a separate question than just are you punished? Like when does it actually deter violations? And deterrence may be that actual goal. Okay. Some related topics, causality. People write books on causality. That's beyond the scope of even a survey on accountability. Anupam Datta and his students have done some work on tying that to blameworthiness. As I said, we use it as a black box. Also, recently accountable algorithms have been of great interest. And that's a slightly different flavor of accountability. So we note that that touches on some of what we think about, but it's a different kind of problem and worth looking at. So now I wanted to fill in that that principal NIM action real estate that I left open before. to say, if we look at all the relationships and directed relationships here between principle and NIM and action and principle and action, we can associate to these concepts that have been identified across the accountability literature. And some of these are ones that are pretty straightforward, and others are things that haven't been talked about as much in computer science, but have been identified in the non-CS accountability literature. Transparency and answerability, things like that, saying, well, that looks like saying, how is the principle connected to their action? You've done this action, you now have to come and answer to us. Or transparency, saying, in doing this action, we have to see the details there. And so we can talk about deterrence and blame for both principles and NIMs. We can talk about attribution, saying, let's start with the action and go back to either the principle or to the NIM. A principle takes on a NIM as an identity, and going backwards, we talk about identification. So as we fill in the arrows between the different possible relationships here, we can identify concepts that people have said, this is accountability related. We can put those in this context. Okay? So our view of this has lets us connect to all sorts of different accountability related concepts. So I mentioned we've been surveying different mechanisms. I'm not going to talk in detail at all about these, but we can look at all sorts of different mechanisms, and even these are just a selection of what's out there, and say, where do these fall in the prevention, detection, evidence, judgment, and punishment system? And we see that not every mechanism provides the same collection of properties. Okay, so it is indeed not just repeating the same properties over and over again in new guises, but there are some fundamental differences here. We can also think about other ways of categorizing these things. One is looking at how much information is required, how much do we need to know about your identity, and if you commit a violation, how broadly is that shared? And also, what kind of action is required? Is this done in a centralized fashion? Is there a punishing entity that's part of the system or outside the system? And we can continue to look at all of these mechanisms that we identify from the literature and say, how do they, where do they live on those axes? And again, they vary. Okay, so which is kind of nice to know. Like, we can identify exemplars of different combinations of points on these in this space and say, here are mechanisms that have been proposed for this. So just we'll note very briefly a couple of key mechanisms. One I'd mentioned before, peer review, collecting lots of data and storing it. Another, which we call as an example of a lightweight localization, the idea that you might ask somebody, have you seen anything wrong with any of your neighbors? And ask their neighbors. This is originally in the context of loss and delay in the internet. And if there's disagreement, then you know that somebody is lying there. Okay? And so this isn't talking about doing authentication or anything like that. So it's a very lightweight way to get your foot in the door of where do I need to investigate more. Okay? So that as a complement to the keep track of everything. Okay? Both provide accountability properties, but you don't have to have this very heavyweight approach in order to get things. And there are lots of other approaches. We've done a little bit to reason about accountability. I'll omit our definitions, but the English, we have an English language result or version of our result. The bottom line of that says that limited identity in the system constrains how punishment can be effected. Okay. So if our goal is to punish violators, we're now able to start talking about, in a formal way, trade-offs between identity properties that the system has or requires and what we can do in terms of punishment. Okay. So that's a concrete benefit of going through the formalization, including the stuff that I skipped over, is we can start to make this precise. Even though this is a pretty intuitive result, to be able to capture that precisely is a nice thing. And other people have looked at some logics and languages for reasoning about these things, done some formal methods work. Jason mentioned identifiable fairness this morning, and guaranteed output delivery. Related to that is a notion of identifiable identifiable abort, where the well-behaving participants learn and agree upon the identity of somebody who committed a violation. That's a fairly recent property. So there's lots of work in this space. So some things in conclusion. I argued at least that accountability is used in many different ways, and we see lots of definitions that fall under these different categories. And they have different points of focus, which isn't bad, but we should identify and clearly distinguish between them. And a lot of them have some sort of punishment or deterrence in mind, at least implicitly. What we've done is we've focused on punishment as a goal. We've put this in trace-based utility theoretic terms. We've done some work to figure out what's the right model of utility that's rich enough to capture the things we need. Turns out that a natural analog of quasi-linear utilities doesn't quite do it. But we've found some that are rich enough and are still amenable to analysis. And we've gotten some preliminary technical results, that theorem and corollary that I noted briefly. So looking ahead, if you're thinking about doing accountability research, fantastic. When you do it, don't say things just like system X is accountable. Like expand on what's meant by that. What is the accountability property? Like, does Bob know that if Alice does not do Y, then her account will be locked for 7 days? Like there's a good concrete accountability property, not just that Alice is accountable for doing bad things. We also think we need more examples of real-world accountable systems, and that can then be evaluated. Okay, so that's another thing we'd like to see. And then I'm sort of biased, but I think studying accountability in and of itself. So further building a theory of accountability and related properties to develop a framework to reason about them. What is achievable? What are the fundamental trade-offs? How do we measure accountability-related properties? Sort of probably a standard question, whatever your favorite topic is, but also terminological questions. It may be that we want to reserve accountability for when there actually is public identification, a sense of answerability, which might be a fine approach to do, but we should be very clear on what is it that we're seeking. That is, are we seeking just punishment, or are we seeking punishment plus some public calling to account? So that's both some looking past and looking forward. And I think the website said, please join us to say thanks, Rebecca. So once again, thanks, Rebecca.
So I think you made the comment that there's relevant work on algorithms and explainability and so on.
Yes.
I think that work is really very relevant. You know, there's this recent EU data regulation that requires decisions that are made by algorithms to be explainable.
Yep.
So why you were turned down for a loan needs to be explainable in terms that ordinary people can understand. Yeah. They also have concepts like interpretability of algorithms. So I think explainability means that you can relate the decision to the input data. And interpretability means you have to be able to identify the features that were used in reaching the decision. And then you also have transparency. So algorithms have to be transparent. There's a big hullabaloo in France about the income tax algorithm not being transparent. And transparent means somehow that the algorithm needs to be accessible to an ordinary person that they can understand it. So I think there's some relationship.
There definitely is relationship. If we wanted to skip lunch, but there has been some work, and I think of it as Joshua Kroll and others at Princeton, arguing that if you don't want to, if in a particular context you don't want to have a transparency in an algorithm for whatever reason, I think they gave an example of State Department issuing visas, then you may still be able to do, say, cryptographic commitments to bind yourself to some procedure where the procedure itself isn't transparent, but you can convince people that you followed your previously identified procedure, which fits in with that as well. But yes, yeah. That's it.
Lunch? Okay.